right. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate you being on the call today. It's great to welcome you all to today's discussion on right-sizing corporate voice, where we have an opportunity to hear from Oxfam about their brief for companies on responsible political engagement. We often talk about promoting worker voice in our programs, and I'm glad we get to talk about right-sizing corporate voice as a way to address the power dynamics that are inherent in our economy. I'm joined today by Andrea Ackerman, Director of Civil Society Engagement at FLA. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Shelley Hahn. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief of Staff at Fair Labor Association. So Andrea is going to be helping us run the webinar, and she's going to be keeping an eye on the questions that I hope that you can put into the Q&A box as we move along throughout the presentations today. Our speakers today are Irit Tamir, Director of Private Sector Development at Oxfam America, as well as Ashley Ahrens, who's the Senior Private Sector Advisor at Oxfam America. And also we'll be joined hopefully later in the call by Jan Wies, who's the Global Head of Social Impact and Human Rights at Nestle. I wanted to let you know that Irit is on the board of FLA as a civil society caucus member, and she's been really instrumental in supporting FLA's progress on creating standards on lobbying and advocacy for our own members. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And I think most of you know that most multinational companies have a corporate social responsibility department and a sustainability report that might detail their work related to social compliance or their environmental footprint. But very few companies are tracking their advocacy footprint to understand what role their company is playing in creating a better enabling environment for their own or others' sustainability activities. And are their lobbying or advocacy activities undermining their stated sustainability goals? So corporate advocacy is an important indicator of how deeply a company has embedded its sustainability goals. And Oxfam's newest report or briefing for companies is a really great primer on how to do it right. So I'm going to turn it over to Irit and Ashley to introduce themselves and to give their presentation. And then we'll come back in a little bit with hopefully some remarks from Jan Wies from Nestle, and then as well as some time for Q&A. So Irit, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I really want to thank the FLA for hosting us on this webinar. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and I really appreciate the work that FLA is doing to also address this issue. I'm Irit Tamir. I am a director at Oxfam America. I run a team of advisors that engage the private sector around Oxfam's mission to fight inequality in order to eliminate poverty. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Ashley, to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Ahrens. I sit within Irit's team, where I work with a lot of US retailers to help them adopt human rights due diligence into their supply chains. I was also the coordinator for the briefing for business that we're going to be talking about. So I hope you liked it, and all feedback is welcome. Thanks.
Great. Andrea, if you could just share the slides, then we'll get going. So you can go to the first slide, please. Or next slide, I should say. Great. So today, our agenda is going to be to talk about Oxfam and this new briefing for business that we have published on corporate political engagement and why we chose to do it now. The case for change, why we think we need to change the way companies do political engagement, what that new approach is that we're asking companies to adopt, and then really a roadmap that Ashley will take you through that talks about the real essential steps that businesses should take. Next slide. So if you don't know Oxfam, Oxfam is an international nonprofit. We work to influence companies and investors in addition to governments, and we do it in a whole host of ways. At Oxfam America, we run campaigns, we do research, we do scorecards and indices. Sometimes we partner with the private sector, but we also hold stock in companies and act as a shareholder. and we employ legal tools to hold them accountable. And of course, we engage public policy as well for regulation purposes. Since the UN guiding principles, however, Oxfam has called on companies to advocate in line with their human rights responsibilities. And in 2018, we published a report called Dollars and Cents, Corporate Responsibility in the Era of Trump. That report really tried to look at how companies were lobbying in comparison to the way they were talking and their policies. And so we looked at three specific issues. We looked at the issue of diversity and inclusion. And as you may know, almost every company has a policy on diversity and inclusion. And we also looked at the topic of climate change. You may recall that in that year that Trump was elected, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And then finally, we looked at the issue of tax. And what we found across 70 companies, some of the biggest companies in the US in 7 different industries, that many of them were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the issue of immigration, refugees, asylum seekers. Many of you may recall that that was the year that the Muslim ban happened in Charlottesville. And many companies were talking a lot about the outrage they had with respect to some of those moments with respect to the president. However, when it came to their lobbying, almost none of them were lobbying on the topic of immigration and refugees. And instead, weren't lobbying at all on this issue. There were a few standouts, and Microsoft, for example, was a standout that was lobbying quite extensively for asylum seekers and for progressive immigration laws. Then we looked at the issue of climate change, and likewise, there were a number of companies that were opposed vocally to us pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Many companies had policies related to climate change and addressing climate change and indicating their support for the Paris Agreement. But I would say much less were lobbying. So there were some that were lobbying in favor of staying in the Paris Agreement, but overwhelming majority were not lobbying at all on this issue. And then we had the issue of tax. And on tax, we heard almost nothing vocally from companies. We also saw no policy around tax. So most companies don't have any policies published on their tax strategies. And yet, this was where we saw the bulk of spending going, was on how to lower corporate taxes at that time. And as you may recall, the Trump tax cuts did get passed for corporations when he became president. So that those lobby dollars really went a long way in terms of influencing the policy choices that happened when Trump was elected. In addition, Oxfam has looked at the issue of political engagement most recently in a report that we published in March. This was a new methodology that measures how companies drive inequality. And this corporate inequality framework that we call it also has indicators on political engagement. And it may not surprise you to learn that pharmaceutical sector and tech sectors spent the most money on lobbying among the top 200 US companies. We also know that allies and companies have made strides in exposing lobbying and making it more transparent. And we're grateful that we have allies that have been working on this issue. But today I'm here to talk about a new report that we published in July, which is a briefing for business on responsible political engagement. And the briefing highlights that corporate influence is at an all-time high and it urgently needs to be addressed. But it also recognizes that business perspectives are critical when it comes to policymaking and that we need to engage business on what that good practice can look like. Next slide. So Why do we need to change the way companies are doing their political engagement? Well, the current situation is really hurting our democracy and society at large. And this is because there is a massive scale of corporate political engagement that is really unbalanced at this moment. Businesses' corporate political engagement also tends to focus on short term financial prioritization, meaning they're really looking for short term financial wins and not for long term value. Um, there is a lack of meaningful disclosure when it comes to corporate political engagement, and all of this is posing an inherent risk of corporate policy capture. In 2022, companies spent $4.1 billion in federal lobbying in the US alone, and business represented 86% of all dollars spent on lobbying. In fact, they are outvoicing all other perspectives. This is just not good for our democracy. Next slide. And we see the risks by companies when they lobby to or do advocacy or when they make political contributions. And you can see these risks: internal misalignment, external misalignment, a revolving door, etc. This current approach is really not working, and we're seeing the impacts on human rights and the environment as a result. We're also seeing damage to public institutions and civic space and increased costs, frankly, to business. A UN 2022 report outlined how corporate political engagement contributes to human rights harms the state's duty to protect, and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So even the UN is seeing this as a problem. We need companies to align political engagement with their corporate responsibility to respect human rights and the environment, and it should be a critical driver for their own priorities as well. Next slide. But the good news is we're starting to see a consensus emerge among civil society, investors, workers, and other corporate stakeholders on a new approach to corporate political engagement that is based on some key principles. One that is based on transparency at its heart, but legitimacy, accountability, consistency, and responsibility. Next slide. And we're also seeing some emerging good company practice. So we have a few examples here. For example, Mars and Unilever have policies that they will not make any contributions to political parties or candidates. On trade associations, we see that Nestle and Unilever have reviewed their trade association memberships and how they align with the Paris Agreement on climate change. When it comes to scientific research, we see that Pepsi has a detailed position on its conduct related to scientific research, that if it sponsors, for example, it will not edit, delay, or prevent a publication because of the nature or favorability of the outcomes, and that the role of Pepsi will at all times be made public through disclosure of the source of funding. And we see that General Mills is really being transparent in providing an overview of policy positions on key topics across environmental, health, and wellness policies. So there are lots of good examples out there already. And in fact, there are already several examples of companies acting on misalignment between trade association positions and their own stated commitment. We've seen businesses exit the US Chamber of Commerce, and oil and gas companies, some of whom have left the American Petroleum Institute over misalignment on climate change. Within the food and drink industry, Coca-Cola and Pepsi both left the Plastics Industry Association over its lobbying approach. And companies, including Mars, Unilever, and Nestle, left the Grocery Manufacturers Association, the primary group for food manufacturers operating in the US, to form its own alliance called the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance so that they could represent more progressive policy positions on health, environmental, and social issues that were more in line with their priorities. Next slide. So, what is this new approach that we're talking about? It is about putting human rights framing to corporate political engagement, meaning that we think corporate political engagement needs to put risk to people, the environment, and the political systems that businesses rely on at the heart of this engagement, which would drive alignment to the concept of long-term business value and a company's social and environmental commitments. Increasingly, companies are applying human rights due diligence to assess human rights risks, take action, track progress, and communicate in accordance with the UN guiding principles. We can build off this for businesses to update their approach to corporate political engagement in a manageable but comprehensive way based on this framework. This includes applying a saliency lens rather than a materiality one, and one with full engagement of potentially affected rights holders. And with that, I will turn over to Ashley to walk you through those key steps.
Well, thanks very much. So next slide, please. So I've just got 2 slides here to talk about some of the actions. The first one you can see is, it's quite high level, but there's 7 key actions, and we've tried to frame this around a human rights due diligence process or other processes that are assess, act, and report, communicate. Looking at assess, the first one is potentially the easiest. It's just to make sure you understand your political footprint. I think a lot of you would already have that in front of you. There may be areas, maybe some political engagement outside of the US or Europe where there's less reporting requirements, maybe things to look at there, maybe checking what your business membership organizations are advocating on. There's that first step. But then the second step is the bigger one, and it might be newer. It's where you're really bringing the human rights lens in there. And as a minimum, that could be taking the issues that you are doing, putting most of your resource around political engagement and trying to think through the human rights risks there. Kind of what of those are most likely to create harm to human rights. And I think probably the first step there is making sure you're speaking to your human rights colleagues, to sustainability teams, making sure that connection is there. But we would suggest going even further than that, and your human rights colleagues, most likely they are doing these regular saliency assessments, like Irit said, where they're looking for all the company's impacts to determine the areas where negative human rights impacts are most likely. And we would suggest engaging with them in that assessment, making sure they're thinking about political engagement within that assessment. And then likely they'll pick the most salient risks and they will zoom in on those. They'll look a lot further, and potentially 1 or 2 of the political engagements you're working in might fit in there. The next set is around activities. The first one is really about addressing some of these practices, and my next slide talks about that. So coming into the middle on policy positions, what we suggest is, as Irit gave some examples on, making sure you have these policy positions on these areas where you're doing most of your policy engagement. And also having policy positions around where these salient human rights risks, where you're most likely to have these negative human rights risks. And then crucially checking the alignment, really making sure that your policy positions are aligned to your human rights commitments. And then we suggest taking that even further, looking at the business membership organizations that you're members of, the suppliers you're working with, doing that similar kind of analysis. And as Irit gave examples, where the divergence is too big, where there is divergence, providing leverage for change, potentially leaving. Then it ends really looking at the transparency, so making sure you're disclosing the policy positions and the actual activities around them. We understand there's probably going to be a lot of activities, so it could make sense to focus on the priority, these most important engagements you've already determined. If some things can't be shared, being clear why and what can't be shared. And then, making sure you're reaching out to other actors. If you're, the suppliers you're working with, other companies, trying to push them along here. And next slide. So here are a few actions. So the report goes into these in more detail, but what it says is these are just potential activities. What you should be doing would, depend by business and the context you're in. So these are more illustrative, but I think they're helpful. I think some of them are fairly self-explanatory, but just to focus on a couple, of course, this idea of stopping where lobbying, where political engagement is actually clearly harmful. Political donations, I imagine there's different views here. I imagine of our listeners, some have clear policies about not making these donations. Others might not have that. I think from our side, we would say that if you are making these donations, you are essentially buying interest. It's not the same as providing information, providing guidance. We also say, as Eric showed, you can just see the amount of the imbalance of spending. All this spending from companies is disempowering all the other voices out there. I think if that's not, perhaps not persuasive, we would still say, even if you are making those donations, make sure they're transparent. Make sure you're revealing the donations, where they're going to, what they are. Important for your shareholders, important for staff, important for rights holders. And I know this is a big area. There's a lot of expertise out there from CPA and Ziegler in this area. Maybe moving over, like I said, some of this I think we've touched upon. I think this idea of bringing marginalized voice, I think is quite powerful. A good idea here. I think it's maybe common for us, if you're being invited into events to share your voice. It's common, perhaps too common, to always say yes. But I think there are definitely moments where you can say, actually, I don't need to give my voice here, and then you can bring in other people to join working groups, join other places. Maybe bring in local NGOs you work in with the rights holders. So I really recommend trying out, just stopping for a second and seeing where you can bring in others. I think the idea on the continuous, there is a lot of good practice out there. We're seeing a lot of boards with responsibility here, which is really important. And we're seeing a lot of these multi-stakeholder groups. That's something I really want to really support, say that how important they are. I think AIM Progress could be a good example here. And of course, the work of FLA, which is why I'm so happy to be here. And thanks very much.
Great, thanks to Erin, Ashley. Appreciate the presentation, and just in time, we've been joined by Jan Weiss from Nestle. Jan, thanks for joining. As I mentioned at the top of the program, Jan is with Nestle. Nestle is also a member company and has worked with on our agriculture committee with IRIT, and they've both of them have been instrumental in creating a new principle for FLA for the agriculture companies around lobbying and advocacy. And I wanted to bring in Jan, first of all, to thank both of you for the contributions that you've made to improving that standard for FLA, and really it's been quite groundbreaking, I think, for a multi-stakeholder initiative to have something related to this. And really appreciate the willingness of Oxfam to engage on it, but also for Nestle for being really forward-leaning on this, and really appreciate it. So I'm also happy, Jan, that you were able to join and give just a few minutes of your perspective on what the importance of having responsible political engagement and how you're approaching it.
Really, and apologies for joining late. I couldn't attend the first part of the presentation, but I have had a lot of discussions with Eric and others on this topic, so I know quite well what this is about. So, no, this exercise of like really testing this new requirement from the FLA was really enlightening, in the sense that it helped us like better understand what we have covered, but also like what are the gaps and how we can improve things, especially in the countries where we operate, like what we call the markets or the country operations. And I really want to insist on this, because at the global level, at the HQ level, we have a global advocacy group. Human rights is one of the 4 topics that we have as priority. So we try to really like guide our businesses and colleagues in the right direction. And I'm quite confident. I think you mentioned a couple of like organizations like AIM instead of AIM Progress, or the Fair Labor Association, ICI, that these multi-stakeholder initiatives that are quite important for us, and we actually leverage to to implement our human rights program. But really, I think the challenge is at the country level, because this the level of awareness of these business associations or multi-stakeholder organizations is not at the same level as at the global level. And very often we are members of these organizations together with, I would say, smaller local companies that tend to be completely honest, much more conservative than we usually are as multinational companies. And I know there are exceptions. I'm not saying that we always, as multinational companies, push for the right things, but I think the level of maturity when it comes to specifically human rights, you can take the UNGPs or the OECD guidelines, is much lower. And I can take the example of Switzerland. We don't need to go very far, or actually to go to so-called developing countries, but just here, like in Switzerland, I mean, I see it when we have conversations actually with smaller companies like SMEs. The discussion is much harder actually to make sure that we put the political agenda in the right direction than it is among multinational companies. And this is not by coincidence, for example, that some of the very newest legislations actually don't actually even look at what is the responsibility of SMEs versus multinational companies. So I think there is, of course, like a role to play for multinational companies to actually make sure that their business associations do the right things. And we've seen a lot of developments in Europe in the last years in the context of these new legislations. Just taking CS3D as an example, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, we actually created even like groups together with NGOs. I'm thinking of the COCOA network, for example. So this group that we created with NGOs actually to really like push the needle on CS3D. I think this is a good example of like companies and civil society organizations getting together to push the political agenda in the right direction. But again, I think the challenge now is really like much more for us, at least in the other countries where we operate and source our raw materials. Because again, there are important discussions that happen there. I was just made aware of a new legislation, a new law in Mexico on child labor that I understand triggered a lot of discussions. And this is where our resources are going.
Thanks, John. Eric, did you want to chime in after that? Or...
No, it's great to hear.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I think it's really important that sorry, I muted myself. You've really described well how companies need to approach this holistically, like to align internally around how the company is operating, because I think a lot of times it's a knee-jerk reaction for companies. They create a CSR department, and they've got this team headed in one direction, but the rest of the company is still kind of plodding along the way it's always been. And I was, I spent 10 years working in the US Congress and working for different members of Congress. And I saw firsthand how I would go to conferences, around, human rights or other things that were happening, and hear the way companies talk, and then see the way that they responded when they were meeting with members of Congress and what they were asking for. And they often did not align. And I think certainly the associations, the trade associations or the other groupings where the members are not as following super closely what's happening within those associations is really important. And so it's great that y'all, that it's part of this roadmap and part of what companies should be paying attention to. They really need to focus on those aspects. Another thing at FLA that I'm really proud to talk about, something positive related to corporate advocacy, is at FLA we've managed to create a really strong group of companies who are willing to speak out on behalf of not only organizations like civil society organizations, but also to work toward better labor laws, to work toward a better enabling environment within the country. As John said, it's really at the country level where a lot of focus needs to be put. And in order for a company to implement FLA standards or any standards that they want to have, they really need a good enabling environment. And so the better the governance aspects are within a country, the better able they are to implement those standards. And so I wanted to give an example of just yesterday, we had a group of companies who spoke out on behalf of a NGO in Cambodia who's been receiving a lot of political pressure from the government. And the reason why this is important is that, NGOs like the one in Cambodia Central, they are, almost like a canary in the coal mine, right? If civil society is not able to operate effectively within a country, companies are less likely to be effective in implementing any types of human rights or even environmental standards in that country. So you really need this a really holistic governance environment that includes respect for civil society. So I was really happy to see that. I'm going to put in the chat a link to that statement that was put out yesterday. But we have several examples of that at the FLA and working with other partners. So we're going to get to some Q&A. And if anybody has some questions, if you could put them in the box. And if not, as moderator, I have lots of questions to ask. And so wanted to first, and Jan, are you able to stay on for the rest of the call, or do you need to jump on? You can stay on. Okay, great. Thanks. All right. So first I wanted to ask, I mean, this is something that I think both Jan and Erid and Ashley can, Oxfam can talk about, is this question of leverage. Because I feel like the first thing that I hear from companies, or the first objection that I hear from companies, is like, oh, we don't really have any leverage, or our sourcing from there is so small, or or really they're just not sure that if they're speaking out, that the benefit is going to maybe outweigh the risk that they might have politically related to speaking out or doing some sort of proactive advocacy. And so I wanted to ask how you might respond to that. And maybe I'll first start with Erid and then go to Jan.
Yeah, and of course, not all companies have the same leverage in every market, and that's understandable. But I do think that what we typically find is that companies don't want to stand out alone, particularly in countries where you might have more authoritarian regimes or less democratic governments. Companies often feel more hesitant, I think, to want to stand out on their own. But we also see when one does it, it gives the courage for others to do it too. And so I think also, being able to work together in initiatives like the FLA to try to get a group to do it can also be really helpful. And then I would say, I think one of the big takeaways from this report is, advocate positively where you can and where it aligns with your goals. But more importantly, don't advocate regressively, because that's actually where we're seeing more of the harm.
Yeah, I think that the first do no harm principle, maybe first before we get to proactive advocacy. Yeah. Jan, how about you in terms of leverage? How do you approach that concept?
I think we do have some leverage, honestly, for sure. I mean, not because of our size only, but also because we have been operating in the countries where we are for decades and sometimes even more. So in terms of like relationships and network, we have it, and this is really based on the good work of our colleagues that are usually from the country itself and have actually built this relationship. So we are there for the long run, and I think that makes a difference also in terms of like our capacity to participate meaningfully in these organizations, but also to engage with politicians and others, other stakeholders in the countries. But one thing I wanted to highlight here is we have an interest in pushing for this legislations, be there like on due diligence or more specific issues like child labor, forced labor, and others, living wage. Because now, like we are obliged to basically deliver on this human rights program. But even before, we had a series of legislations in Europe and in the US. If you really, as a company, if you want to deliver on this agenda, there are things that you can do on your own. Of course, you can leverage your supply chain partners. You can talk to business partners, your JVs partners. You can also like reach out to stakeholders, as I mentioned before. But it will always be limited, right? Because very often we talk about systemic issues. So of course you can actually improve things in your own supply chain, but if you really want to address some of the root causes that you face as a company and as society overall, you need actually to go collectively. And so this is really where leverage comes in, and where this work on advocacy is so important. It's so important. I've been with Nestlé for 13 years, and most of my time I spend it more like on the operational side of it. So trying to develop the program and build the resources and equip my colleagues to really operationalize this program. And now I'm spending most of my time on advocacy, building the capacities that are needed in the countries where we operate, so my colleagues can engage, I think, in a positive way. Here it's to your point. So actually to push for these legislations that we know will help us as a company also implement these requirements and implement our own human rights agenda. So I understand it's not always positive. There's also a lot of advocacy, lobbying there that sometimes actually go against progressive legislation, and this should not be allowed. But we should not underestimate the positive angle of advocacy as well. So advocating for the human rights agenda or specific issues that not only help society in this country, thrive and enjoy their rights, but also us implement our own human rights due diligence program selfishly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. I mean, companies, I think, rightly sometimes feel like this burden of governance has been pushed on them because there are governance gaps in countries, right? Like schooling for children or, education, things like that, which really should be government functions, are often pushed onto companies. And so by companies helping to ensure that those governance gaps are closed, and that there are effective legislation, effective implementation of legislation, effective implementation of labor laws, et cetera, that lessens the burden on companies when they're trying to implement these standards. And yeah, I sometimes feel the pain of companies, who are feeling like, why should we be responsible for this? But the fact that you're needing to source from a certain country means that everybody has to work together on addressing those shortcomings. But agree that having a place and a platform, as Ira was saying, where people can work together to address these governance gaps, is really important. And like I said, I think FLA does help provide that. We've also just so others know, we work really closely with other MSIs, particularly working on governance gaps in, for example, around living wage or other labor laws that might be, coming up in different countries. We recently did some work in Bangladesh and other places. So I think that using the platforms is really important, because I do think that companies feel like sometimes going it alone is really difficult. And if you're the only one out there, it can feel lonely.
Actually, can I come in this point as well? Maybe just to give another example. But when I heard that question about we don't have enough leverage, it made me think of, I shouldn't vote because it's not going to change anything. And of course, I'd say businesses actually have a very big impact. But of course, in some contexts, it would be less than others. But it is quite large. Like one thing, an example, I really like the example you shared. A lot of my work involves working in seafood. And there's an example I came across recently, and I'll put it in for chat, the Seafood Working Group in Thailand, just a collection of large US and other retailers, Thai processors, and other companies, recently put out a statement to the Thai government, kind of pushing back against reforms to reduce that would reduce labor. What's the wording here? Anyway, they put out a letter to kind of suggest better labor protections in Thailand in the seafood sector, which I think was quite impressive from the members there. And there was a range of businesses involved. I think particularly a number of US retailers had a big role there, pushing the network, working with colleagues in Thailand to push for that. So I'll put a link in here. But that brings me to another point. What's quite strong from the human rights angle is picking areas to focus on. There's so many issues to focus on. There's so many countries, so many supply chains. What we really say is taking this saliency assessment, focusing on what are the biggest human rights risks? What are the biggest, where are you putting most of your resources and your political engagement, and really focusing on those, looking at the networks in those particular areas.
I'll just comment on this, Shelly, if I may, yeah, because I think I just want to agree with you, Ashley. I mean, because that, and I think Shelly, you also asked about how we get organized within these big companies, because some people can say one thing and others can say a different thing, and this is an issue. In our case, the salient issue action plans that we released 2 years ago really like that from that perspective. So just, I mean, to make sure that we actually are all aligned around the objectives that, we set for ourselves for the next years. But also because, to your point, Ashley, I mean, that helped us prioritize issues and countries where we know that we need to make a difference. And by actually engaging with governments to push actually for such legislation, depending on the priorities that we have in these countries. But also from a resources perspective, it has helped us make sure that they actually go to the right places, and we actually mobilize our colleagues in these countries to really do some active engagement that is necessary to address some of the gaps that we talked about. Because we are big, I mean, we need to make choices, but I just want to say that this talents exercise has been quite helpful for us, also for that purpose of selecting which countries we want to really have an impact on.
Yeah, prioritization, I think, particularly for a country, I mean, a company the size of Nestle is probably a difficult exercise. So I wanted to ask, how, Jan, from inside a company, how would you suggest that companies go about coordinating, internally? I know it can be different in every company because of the size. But what are the sort of maybe the inflection points for, a corporate social responsibility team who might be working with either advocacy or their government relations team? And then I think Irid and Ashley, you guys had some examples or some best practices around that. So maybe we could dig into those.
So I want to be realistic here, but there's also a bit of a sense of urgency here in Europe, because we are facing so many new legislations in that space, and it's not a complaint, but it's just the reality. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time right now on CSRD, and so I'm saying this because this is really pushing companies, I think, in the right direction in terms of how they get organized from a governance perspective, but also policies, management systems. This is super demanding. So if you don't know how to do things, just read the CSRD. It's quite long, a few hundred pages, but but it should give you a good sense of what you should do and what you will have to do starting next year. And then CS3 pushes it even further. But just one thing that has been super helpful for us at Nestle, and I know it can look at as a minor thing, but setting up a community, so a human rights community, so people actually working on the topic of human rights, maybe not full time, but that are actually associated with the implementation of the program in a way or another, or have an interest in human rights and want to actually use what they do, their function or their skills to contribute to the agenda, has been really interesting and has made a huge difference. Of course, in addition to the formal governance structure where decisions are being made, but having a network that can exchange and also sometimes talk about these things, these challenges. So we are part of this organization. Typically, they took a position that we are not comfortable with or go against our own position. Who actually is part of it? How can we engage with? How can we use our leverage? these are discussions that are sometimes difficult to have within a formal structure because it comes with a decision, and so sometimes it's just like difficult to raise these things. But as part of maybe like a more informal structure where you can really like build a network, I mean, it can help as well. So I think it's a really good way to get started for newcomers to start exchanging on this, because it can sometimes feel very lonely actually to push this agenda just by on your own.
Garrett, Ashley, anything to add on that point?
Ashley, do you want to start maybe?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, depends, I guess, where you are. I guess on this journey, I think the first step, clearly many companies are long past that, is making sure that that conversation is happening, that the public affairs officers are regularly talking to the human rights officers. And Jan's exactly talked about that, how you create that space. I mean, that's the first step. If you have that in place, and there's a couple of things you could be looking at. You could be making sure your human rights team is just looking over your main bits of policy engagement. So, I mean, first of all, you need to have your policy statements on issues such as, let's say, freedom of association, tax, and other areas. Then you'd want your human rights colleagues to look over those, give their reflections, any concerns. Hopefully they have none. And the other way around as well, that you would want your when your human rights colleagues are going through their assessments, the saliency risk assessment, they're deep diving into things. You want to make sure that you're inputting on that they're thinking about some of your work. So a good step here is really to ask them about what are their plans. Are they planning any deep dives, and seeing if you can get involved in those.
I will say I did recently have a conversation with a very large multinational company that was doing a whole mapping. So they were going through a very robust mapping exercise in every part of the company, all the way down to every subsidiary, every country, to understand just what trade groups are they part of, what associations are they part of, and what is the purpose for them being part of those associations and groups, to see how they align or maybe misalign with their priorities. So, it's a huge undertaking, and I appreciate that it is, especially for a large multinational corporation. But what a valuable exercise for them to be doing, to really get a handle then on where they're putting both their money, time, energy, and public association.
Yeah, that's a great first step from both Ashley and Eric. Thanks. And we got a question from John. Thanks, John. I'll just read it out here. There's a robust track record and set of lessons regarding what works in responsible corporate political engagement in the US and other political contexts. And he's put it, I think there's, yes, a link in the chat. He's asking Jan, what opportunity do you see for high road advocacy coalitions, for example, around forced or child labor and climate impacts?
Yeah, I mentioned before this COCOA coalition that we created in Europe. I'm less familiar with the US, sorry about that. But I think this COCOA coalition is quite interesting because it was, to my knowledge, one of the first times that different stakeholders would actually get together and agree on a common agenda as part of a specific legislative process, and speak of one voice when that was needed. And of course, I'm not going to say that it's always been easy, but I think it has made a difference also to the eyes of the legislators and regulators, because when you can actually go to them and speak to them as a representative of the coalition, I think this is even more credible than if you just go as Nestlé or as an NGO or another organization. So this is great. This is something that we are looking at replicating also, like in other sectors for other legislative processes. And I think the reason for that is because we truly have a common interest. Like when I say we, companies and civil society organizations, especially when it comes to these legislations. And like we might disagree on things in terms of like liabilities or and these types of elements, which is fine. But as I would say, like we agree on a lot of elements. When you look at HRDD legislation, so more specific pieces of legislation, I think we agree on the direction of travel, and then disagree on the details. But I think there is space actually to create more coalitions to actually push for these legislations, because if you look at the world, I mean, there are not too many of them. And I know this is progressing and this is evolving. We have a legal tracker that actually tells us exactly what is being discussed where, but the map is still quite empty when it comes to especially HRDD legislation. So this is what we want to push, because we have an interest in doing it. And I hope we can really work with CSO organizations also, like in these countries, not only in Europe or in the US.
Yeah, that's a great point about working with CSOs. And I'm wondering, Erin, if you have thoughts on how do companies ensure that, I mean, I know that a lot of the report is focusing on the sort of the do no harm part of corporate political engagement, of bringing down sort of that level of the voice. But if companies are engaging in positive political advocacy around, the priorities that they've set, how should they be engaging with civil society on these priorities or on the engagement work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a number of good examples of civil society and companies coming together on some issues. I think CSDDD is one where civil society really encouraged businesses to sign on to a statement. And it was a statement that was crafted primarily, frankly, by civil society, and then companies signed on to it. And Nestle, I believe, was one of those companies that did so. But it can be challenging because, as Jan says, a lot of times we may agree on the direction of travel, but it's some of the specifics with respect to the piece of legislation where there may be disagreement. Nevertheless, I think if we can find some common ground, it does make it much more powerful if we can get companies and civil society to speak together in some of these countries. And certainly, I know, at least from Oxfam's standpoint, we always stand ready to work with companies on progressive legislation. So would welcome that.
Yeah, and Jan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, can I? Yes, yeah. I just want to say something. I don't know whether this is the right word. I don't think that's an official terminology, but I really like talking about technical advocacy, and by that I mean advocating for things that we know work on the ground, versus like having like a political agenda that is really like at a much higher level. And I think the FLA is super well positioned actually to like embark maybe a bit more in this technical advocacy space because of your membership, because of your experience as an organization, and really actually go and engage with legislators, regulators for actually the challenges that we all face on the ground. I think there is it also makes, based on our experience, it makes our engagement also like much more credible and legitimate when we actually go and have chats with legislators, because very often, to be honest, they don't know what they talk about when it comes to like how to implement a human rights program on the ground. I mean, they have great ideas, but they have rarely actually visited the cocoa, coffee, or palm oil plantation. Have rarely interacted also with rights holders or stakeholders on the ground. And I think they need to not to be taught, not at all, but to hear actually from us, companies, civil society organizations, on what works, what doesn't. And of course, we'll have like different opinions sometimes, but it's important that we bring this experience at that level of decision making as well.
Yeah, I love that term technical advocacy, because I do think it actually was kind of the point I was going to make, was that you do often have these high level statements or high level commitments, and then it then sometimes kind of lacks that next step of seeing the how the action actually happens on the ground. And so just one really quick example is that we have this commitment to responsible recruitment, which is we have a lot of companies in the apparel space who've signed on to the employer pays principle. It's great. We're using that to create what we hope is economic drivers, you know, on the demand side for suppliers to actually have responsible recruitment policies. But, you know, you have this call, but then what happens next, right? And so really what we're working on now is this technical advocacy where we're working directly with the government of Taiwan, for example, on specific changes to the law or specific things that need to happen in order for better recruitment, responsible recruitment to happen. And so those things really do need to go hand in hand. And so great that you create a platform, great that we have these things, but we also need to then follow through. And so I love that point. That's a great way to think about it. Okay, so we're just a couple minutes left in the webinar. Irit, Ashley, Jan, any last thoughts, or are we ready to wrap up?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would just want to thank you again, Shelley and Andrea, for hosting the webinar, but also would just say for those that are participating, you know, we'd love any engagement you have with the Briefing for Business, any feedback on it, but also, especially for companies, would love to know how we can support implementing the roadmap that's in there. And we know, you know, this is not an easy undertaking, but there are some really key, I think, first steps that companies can take that we've talked about, and would love to support companies in doing that.
Great. Well, Irit, Ashley, Jan, Andrea, thanks everybody. Thanks all the attendees for joining us. And we'll look forward to the next discussion on this. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.